Hi, Rishabh.
Hi, and so nice to be able to do this with you.
Same
Like I
here.
was,
Lovely to.
like I was telling all of these wonderful 1,000 people who've taken out time on a Sunday evening to come and join us,
Wow. Wow.
uh, and that it's your book has actually caused a lot of furore across the political fraternity and even at general public at large, because you've written about a man who doesn't need much introduction, but let me start by introducing the book and you for the few who don't know you and don't know about the man that we're talking about. So the man we're going to
Right.
be essentially talking about today has written 38 books, is regarded as the founder of Hindutva, is venerated by both the BJP and its ideological parents, the RSS. And though the bunch of thoughts of Golwalkar are different and the policies of Hegdeshwar are slightly different from that of the man that we talk about, hopefully by the end of this conversation you'll be able to tell whether you want to live in Vinayak Savarkar's Bharat or whether you want to live in Mahatma Gandhi's India. Let's find out what the man who's written about him has to say, and it's just the first book from a two-part series. So I'm too late for the first book, and I hope that I'm the first one for the second one. Uh, the man that we're talking about is Savarkar, and the book that we're speaking about is the one that is written by this wonderful erudite gentleman that we're talking to today. Welcome to IMON's author series, Vikram Sampath. Thank you for
Thank you,
doing this.
Rishabh. Thank you. Thank you so much. And a very good evening to everyone. 1,117 people on a Sunday evening is truly impressive, and I think the it's hats off to you and your whole team there that puts this together.
This is more hats off to the team and more hats off to the person who's coming in, because sometimes that 11117 is only 17, and sometimes it is the number that is there. So it's also about the book and the man that's coming in. But let me ask you at the very outset, many of these questions have been formed by young people, right? So they don't represent necessarily my views personally, but we've crowdsourced these questions for you. So from all the 10 million kids that we impact, who I always wish followed me on Instagram, but they never listen, we sent across we sent across communication saying that we are having this session, and many of the people that you see today, some of them have actually formed these questions. So I'll start with the first one, and you patronize Savarkar as a freedom fighter, and you basically say that he's a freedom fighter and so on and so forth, and he's contributed to the national freedom struggle. And in the first book, which is up to 1924, you've elucidated that he's contributed to it, and nobody's going to take that away from him and his contribution. But at the same point in time, don't you think that he was an apologist to the cause of the British, given the fact that his multiple letters in jail, and you've actually spoken about them in the last few chapters of your book, the first book, where you actually write saying that that was similar to what Shivaji was thinking. But don't you think that that's an unfair comparison, given the fact that Shivaji actually went about going about doing the same activities after his initial hardship, whereas when it comes to Savarkar, he actually didn't participate in the Quit India movement of 42, didn't in a large way was away from the freedom struggle and also from the Indian independence movement in its different forms as it existed back then. So don't you think that instead of a freedom fighter, giving him the due respect, don't you think that it's eulogizing or patronizing him too much?
Thank you. That was a long question, and I hope I can answer it in a short, concise manner. So first of all, you started saying you patronize him. So I'd like to clarify that one is, I'm not patronizing anybody. I'm not an apologist for Savarkar. I'm not his lawyer or spokesperson. As a historian, I think the responsibility of a good historian is to illuminate the facts and bring them out into public domain. In the case of Savarkar, for the longest period of time, He's been a persona non grata in terms of discussions around him. You can hate him, you can love him, you can do what you may, but then, having even a blackout of any kind of discussion, an objective discussion based on facts, based on records, which are screaming to be told, not only records in India, but across the world, which I accessed for this book, to not even have access to that. I think that is very antithetical to the very foundations of what a democracy and a liberal democracy needs to be. Year after year, in Europe, we have multiple books that were written, that are written on even someone like Adolf Hitler. So you can hate someone, but then don't blacken out that person from discourse.
Yeah.
And the last biography on Savarkar was written in 1960, and in this 50 years, nobody, despite what you said, he is so relevant, his ideology is so relevant to today's times. Despite that, he's a discussion around him in academic circles or in political circles or in public discourse is not happening. And so that, I think, was the biggest problem area. The second point, you talk about freedom struggle. Now, when we say freedom struggle, I firmly believe as a historian that there was no one the freedom struggle. And just as today, people get hammer and tongs saying that those who say, we don't agree with a particular government or with a particular party, they're anti-national, go away to Pakistan, and these kind of things. Similarly, this is very much similar. Those who did not participate in the freedom struggle, the Quit India movement, they had nothing to do with freedom. They had no contribution. So they just need to be excised out of the narrative of those who fought for the freedom. So I think there were parallel streams. There were multiple narratives to our freedom movement. The non-violent movement, the mass movement that Gandhiji led, of course, that was the mainstream movement, which has been mainstreamed for all of us also through these generations. But then we should not forget that all through, right from 1857, when you had the first War of Independence, which was called by the British as the Sepoy Mutiny, to the naval mutiny of 1946 in Bombay, there was an unending stream of armed conflict. Of a violent mass movement, which in my view is what got India her final independence, and not the armed, the non-violent struggle, because the Quit India that you talk about petered down in 2 months after it was launched, and it went away in 1942 and in 1947. So it took 5 years for the impact to drill down to the British for them to realize that they need to go. That seems a little odd. So what are the causal effects of freedom? That needs to be investigated too. So the other point that you raised was the thing that I keep hearing often about this whole, oh my God, he sold out and all of that. And that's one reason why I included not almost all the petitions that he wrote in the appendix to the book. And it's there for people to see in their original, that nowhere was it an apology to the British. Yeah, it was not asking, it was not a mercy petition. In Hindi, the term is yachika. So, every prisoner, every political, prisoner had the option to actually file a petition. It was a legal recourse, just as you could have a lawyer, you could file a petition to seek a release from jail. He was given the highest, 50 years of 2 imprisonments to life in Kalapani, in the most horrendous kind of situation that a human being could face there, that he had to go through. And this after what? We spoke about freedom. So somebody who starts India's first secret society, which was the Rashtrabhakta Samuha, which later became Mitra Mela and the Abhinav Bharat, someone, he and his cohort were the first to actually seek for a complete freedom for India. Way back in 1905, the Purna Swaraj of the Congress actually came to fruition only in 1930. So in 1905, we had people like this, the revolutionaries, who were talking for complete freedom for India. Somebody who organized the first ever student bonfire, in Pune in 1905 after the partition of Bengal, for which he was rusticated from college and paid a heavy price for it, and who became like the leader of sorts in London in the 5 years that he studied there at India House, under Shamji Krishna Verma, and all these fascinating, lovely, wonderful revolutionary characters there who, staked their lives for the cause of complete liberation of this country. So all of this happened, for which he was sent to jail. And in the jail, so the letters, nowhere does he first of all talk of, I'm sorry about what I did, but then it was a it was a legitimate right that was given to all prisoners, especially after the First World War and during the First World War, where the royal proclamation of Emperor George V was allowing prisoners, not only in India, but in all her colonies of Britain, to file for petitions as a matter of goodwill. The government was releasing a lot of people. So, and the second point was he was also acting as a spokesperson for the other revolutionaries, the young revolutionaries who were lodged at cellular jail. And in his 1917 petition, for instance, he says that if my name constitutes an obstacle in the release of all the other prisoners, you can omit my name and release the others, and that will give me as much joy as my own release would. So that makes it very clear that it was not something that he was doing only for himself, but for the other prisoners as well. And you see contemporary records, the record which I've quoted in my book as well, you know, the interviews that British officials had with him during his incarceration. They say every time we spoke to him, he had no sense of remorse or regret for whatever he did. And his own fellow prisoners also talk about the same, the same thing. And so including someone like Mahatma Gandhi actually filed a petition on behalf of Savarkar and his elder brother, saying they have been brave men, so release them. So if Savarkar is a stooge, a coward, then Gandhi, who actually filed a petition on his behalf, also becomes one then, so by inference. So I think history has a lot of nuance which one needs to look into when one makes value judgments about characters of the past.
Fair. So I do concede to the point that Savarkar is being forgotten, that we hear very little about Savarkar, and I've seen your conversations where you mentioned that in the ICSE books and the ISC books, in the CBSE books, there's nothing to be found. I think even in the state-run schools and also in the CBSE schools, the curriculum or the IB curriculum, there's very little that is written about Savarkar. So I must congratulate you on putting together that the entire book. But there might be a reason why the Congress might have probably deleted him. Some say that, and again, this is what a lot of young people have also said, that some say that a young Savarkar, and I think you've written it in your book, where, if I remember correctly, you yourself narrate an incident where a young Savarkar goes with his friends and vandalizes a mosque. Now, then he feels the need to militarily train his friends, and then that in the long run has led to this culture which is if I don't get my way, I will go ahead and even start being violent in a way which is very different from how Mahatma Gandhi approached his freedom struggle. Now, when it comes to people such as this, aren't you setting a wrong example where you've taken up arms when you don't get something? And when I understand that when it comes to the freedom struggle, but when it comes to Hindu-Muslim violence, don't you think that that's setting a wrong example? I also accept that Manishankar Ayyar is not right when he goes and does the same thing in a way. But at the same point in time, don't you think that it is incorrect and that's probably one of the reasons why Savarkar was not spoken about when it comes to from 1947 to 2020 when it comes to our school textbooks? Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think multiple reasons for that. Though I think the toxicity around him increased more only around 1999-2000 when the first NDA government came to power under Mr. Vajpayee, and you had this whole canonization of him with that plaque at Cellular Jail in his honor by the Petroleum Ministry, and also his portrait unveiled in the Central Hall of Parliament. And because even when he died, someone no less than the Prime Minister, then Indira Gandhi, had such high praise for him as his role in the annals of Indian freedom struggle being something which is so unique. He's a very symbol of patriotism and valor and sacrifice and all of that. Unless, of course, you think it's just a homily that a prime minister had to give to anybody who died. I'm sure Indira Gandhi was smarter than that, than to just, pay rich tribute to somebody who was a stooge, who was a coward, who was a Muslim hater, who was a Gandhi murderer, and all of that. I'm sure she would not have done that if all of that was true. So the calumny and the hatred against him came to the fore more towards the end of the century and the the early part 2000, where I think till then the Congress too was more generous in its acceptance of the so-called Indian right wing, the Hindu right wing, because it was not a force to contend with. The Jan Sangh was hardly there, and even in 1984 there were just 2 seats in parliament, with Advani and Vajpayee being the only 2 people there. But I think the time when there was when an NDA government was formed, I think that's when the alarm bells started ticking that, okay, this is a power that can actually unseat us from our entrenched positions. And ever since, you see this narrative of him being, groveling for whatever, mercy, or him being this violent man, all of that has been enhanced a lot more. It's all about contesting narratives. As George Orwell said, he who controls the past controls the present and the future. So that's why the history becomes such an important tool.
So you become so very important. So you become the kingmaker then.
I wish we historians had that power, at least. I don't know, but people misuse my discipline, misuse history. They don't use historians, unfortunately. So a lot of mumbo jumbo goes around as legitimate history. So this is one reason why I think he and that though I mean he was acquitted in the Gandhi murder trial. I think the taint of that continued to stand. It was like an albatross around his neck. Legally, he was exonerated, but the moral albatross somehow, and that comes up even now. Time and time again, when there's this talk of conferment of the highest civilian honor, Bharat Ratna, and all of that. That's talked about. Now, to this whole issue of militarization and so on, I'd like to draw your attention and those of everybody who's logged in to the words of someone no lesser than Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who in his very seminal book, Pakistan and the Thoughts on Partition, he draws to a very alarming, tendency in the Indian army during and before and after the Second World War. He says, the communal composition of the army has become so skewed under the British that we have almost 60 to 70% of the army, which is composed of a particular community, in this case Muslims. And someone nonetheless than Ambedkar, whom I'm sure nobody is going to doubt his so-called secular credentials and all of that, says that this is a cause of huge concern for this country, because are they going to be faithful when a co-religionist is going to attack your borders at Afghanistan? And these are his own words in that book. So he says it is a matter of alarm for all the Hindus to actually see that in the very likely event of the British leaving this country, there's going to be a massive civil war, a power struggle between these 2 dominant communities, which is what eventually happened, and in which one community is well armed and can fight back. The other has been made so pusillanimous by this whole idea of non-violence that you can't even stand up to defend yourself. Are you going to lose your lives, your faith, your property, everything that you hold dear, or are you going to take up weapons to defend yourself? And so Ambedkar himself says that this is something that the Hindu community, and he was actually a very he was not a very big fan of the Hindu community. He never called himself a Hindu. He called himself a depressed class. He converted to Buddhism and all of that. Someone like him also saying that this was what it is. So that's why I urge that, when we take statements of leaders of the past like this, be it Gandhi, be it Ambedkar, Jinnah, Savarkar, Nehru, it's very easy for us, and the temptation is so high that we contextualize it in today's definitions. Islamophobia and communal, secular, this and that. Whereas we need to see and appreciate it in the context in which it was made. Was it necessary then? Was it really a requirement? And these people were responding to the social circumstances of that time and what was necessary for the country and the society. And that is why, they did and said what they did and said.
Fair. So you're basically saying that don't extrapolate something that's happened in the 1600s and then bring it out here. It's not economics and math, it's history. And it's statements that are made. Correct. True. No, your arguments are very rational, and just like people said, Veer Savarkar was a rational man. But then again, it kindles this question in my mind also. You mentioned that he's contributed so much to the freedom struggle in a way that the freedom struggle was much more than Gandhi, and that everyone accepts, much more than the Quit India movement. But what I'm sorry.
Do they accept?
I think a large
I don't
part
think so.
of young people that I interact with, at least, feel that there is so much more to the freedom struggle. Then again, like some may accept Savarkar, some may not. But at the same point in time, the real question is like you've written in your book, and so many people come on these on our platform and tell us that the real heroes of the Indian freedom struggle had never been spoken about. And to that end, my question is this: that if Savarkar did not like the ideology of Gandhi, you had at that juncture Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, you had the Azad Hind Force, you had so many other options in terms of contributing to the Indian freedom struggle. Why do we not see Veer Savarkar and the Hindu Mahasabha contributing to people outside the sphere of then what was the Indian National Congress?
I'm so glad you brought this up, because that is precisely what happened. So Rash Bihari Bose, the founder of the INA, was an ardent fan of Savarkar, and right from 1937, in the second volume, I bring out lots and lots of correspondences between these two. And Rash Bihari Bose, who was also the founder of the INA, also forms a chapter of the Hindu Mahasabha in Japan, and it's almost subservient to the Hindu Mahasabha, and so all through these secret societies that Savarkar formed were all inspired by what the young Italy that Mazzini and Garibaldi and all the Italian revolutionaries espoused, and not the Marxist lineage of revolution, where the fundamental idea was this: can you create a disaffection in the British Indian Army, which was composed largely of Indians? So by the time of the Second World War, you had 2.5 million Indian soldiers in the British Army, controlled by about 40,000 British overlords. So the minute you could seduce these soldiers to the virtues of patriotism and bring them over to the cause, even 10% of them, defect to the other side, then the sun would set on the empire sooner than it was expected. And the British were mortally scared of that. The repeat of the 1857, which was again what they called a mutiny in the army. And eventually that's what happened. The INA, in fact, Netaji actually is supposed to have met Savarkar on the 22nd of June, my dates are bad as a historian, 22nd of June 1940, 6 months before he actually, left India. And that's where the linkages were actually made. He told him about Rash Bihari Bose. The details of that meeting can never be known, because these are secret meetings, but the conjectures have to be drawn, the dots have to be connected. There's not going to be a minuted document saying what all they discussed. It was such a secret meeting. But 6 months after that meeting is when he goes away, and the person who helps Netaji in this is this lady called Savitri Devi, again a very fascinating woman whom I portray in my second volume. She was a French woman who was actually a huge adulator of Hitler, and then becomes so taken in by this whole Aryan supremacy. She comes to India, she converts to Hinduism, she marries a Bengali in Calcutta, Mr. A.K. Mukherjee. And Mukherjee and Savarkar, there are lots of correspondences. Savitri Devi is writing lots of letters to Savarkar and vice versa. And Savitri Devi and her husband are the one who are the Nazi underground operators in Calcutta, and they are the ones who help Netaji make that connect with Hitler. So when Netaji leaves this country, he first goes to Japan, he meets Hitler, and there's a Hitler's India Legion force that is created in the Indian National Army, where Germany and Hitler actually helped us in our struggle against the British. So this was precisely what was done, what you mentioned, where this militarization drive that Savarkar was running, most of these soldiers, many of them defected over to the INA side. And in fact, when the INA trials were held in 1945-46, in fact, that too I quote in the forthcoming book, where many of these soldiers, under testimony, they quote that we joined the army at the behest of Barrister Savarkar. And that's when we then, got trained in arms, in warfare, and then moved over to the INA. So that was precisely what was the strategy that was adopted. Of course, one could ask, why did he not do it himself? He could have escaped out of India and done all of this. But then one must realize that his health was in doldrums. In 45-46, he had 2 heart attacks, and he was almost dead by 45. The long years of incarceration in cellular jail had actually ruined his bones, he had arthritis, he could hardly eat because his digestive system had gone for a toss, and his health was by and large, even when he took over as the president of the Hindu Mahasabha, very poorly affected. So directly you could not do, so you probably pass on the baton to someone who's younger and fitter and who can probably take inspiration from you and do what you could not do.
Fair. So you said that he motivated people and, in a way, asked them to join the force and so on and so forth. But at the same point in time, wasn't it the same Savarkar who said, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're the historian, in 42, didn't he say that please don't participate in the Quit India movement, stick to your force, fight with the British? Isn't this in a way, fight with the British for the war? Yes, fight with the British and in the war. And isn't this in a way also, and the reason why I repeat this is, isn't this in a way working against, or did work against, the freedom struggle? And I know there were different ideologies, but like you said, Mahatma Gandhi was one of the ones who actually helped in terms of clemency petition. So when it came to things such as national unity, don't you think that what he mentioned in 42 was wrong, and the fact that, or do you think that that's something that's okay?
Look, the issue is much more complex, because in 1942, when Gandhi launched the Quit India movement, so again, it's part of my volume 2, and you're getting all the secrets out of me, Rishabh. There's nothing going to be left for us to have an interview during the launch of the volume 2. But then, most of the...
It's a good thing. It's setting the tone for the rest of your conversations.
Yeah, I know. I'm bored of saying the same old things that I've already said in the past. So in 1942, if you actually see the timelines, till February, March, you had Stafford Cripps who was here. The Cripps mission was almost going to be clinched. The Congress, Nehru and Maulana Azad, who were negotiating on behalf of the Congress with Cripps, had accepted most of the proposals, though Cripps had actually said every province would have the right to self-determination. They could move to either to Pakistan or India. So we would have probably had a bigger Pakistan than what was eventually given to them. The only party which stoutly opposed Cripps on this particular basis, that we are not going to allow a division of this country, was the Hindu Mahasabha. So there was a lot of internal ferment within the Congress following the Cripps mission, and Gandhi was being increasingly sidelined in the party. So a lot of commentators, including his contemporaries, say he devised the civil disobedience movement to regain his control over the party and his own relevance within the party, with not even an iota of planning, with not much of a goal that was set as to what did you want out of the Quit India movement. Now, if you see the memoirs of Nehru, of Maulana Azad, forget Savarkar. I mean, these people, including Gandhi's trusted aide Rajgopalachari, they were opposed to the Quit India movement. They said this movement has no basis, because just saying quit India, they're not going to quit India. And this at a time when the Japanese were at our borders. Any time a Japanese invasion of India was very, very imminent, to create civil unrest within the country and not putting goals to the British, saying what exactly do you want out of them, was completely foolhardy and jail-filling exercise. So within a day of Gandhi announcing this in August, he and the entire Congress top brass was actually arrested. So the movement was launched. There was no plan of action. There was no program, and it was left to the people to carry it on in the way they wanted to carry it on. So something like a Gandhian movement, which is supposed to be non-violent, the Quit India movement was one of the most violent and bloody. It was almost like a revolution within the country, where the movement itself got sabotaged by a lot of others outside the Congress fold, the former revolutionaries, ex-army people. Everyone came. You had killings, you had railway lines being cut off, telegraph lines being cut off at a time when communication was important for the British to carry on their war against Japan, which was going to invade India and probably take India over. So in such a case, many people actually opposed the Quit India movement, and there was no real plan of action that was there against what you wanted to achieve from this. And with all the leaders being in jail, it was a leaderless movement. And from 1942 to 44, Gandhi was then lodged in the Aga Khan Palace as a detainee, and so there was no way he could guide the movement or give it any sense of direction. So in such a case, a lot of people who were more strategic and not sentimental opposed a movement which caused more harm in a way to the cause of the country at that time. So, but then when you say fight with the British, this was again, you are saying, on the one hand, people say, oh, he was a Nazi lover. He was pro-Hitler. So he can't be both, he can't be fighting with the British and also be a fan of Hitler. He can be one of the two. So, because the British and the Nazis were not the best of buddies. So again, there the thing was join the army, militarize yourself, extract as much as possible from the British. And also, I think the constant tussle for the Hindu Mahasabha was that they were feeling left out in all negotiations that the government was doing, the Viceroy was doing. The high table was always reserved only to the Congress and the Muslim League. So the Hindu Mahasabha also wanted to be a part of these negotiations, saying we represent the voices of the Hindu community. The Congress is not the sole representative. So this was one way of also seeking their, because finally after 1937, a large part of what freedom struggle was all about negotiations and trying to get more and more out of the British, where them leaving us was almost like a forethought. But what would be the structure of that? Would it be dominion status? Would it be complete independence? All of that, those details had to be worked out. So the Hindu Mahasabha wanted a seat at the high table of negotiations, and that was the strategic reason for having tacit support, but there were underlying reasons for that support as well.
So which is why they wanted a seat at the high table. So which is why when and correct me again if I'm wrong, as soon as the Indian National Congress basically gave up its right to form government in order to protest against the British, the Hindu Mahasabha, in alliance with the Muslim League, actually took up administering a lot of provinces across India and were a part of that so-called negotiation with the British, and in alliance with people that he actually, if I'm correct in understanding, did not really get along with, which is in case of and I wanted to touch upon also what you mentioned about Hitler, but before that is a very important thing, because it's very important in the current political context, that one end you try to project him as a person who believes in a secular country and a secular India, and at the same time he's basically somebody who's compared Muslims to Jews. And this is where I want to draw that comparison to him praising the Nazis, where he basically says, just as the Jews failed to integrate in German society, so also the Muslims must integrate into India. Is this correct? Is my understanding correct when I say that he's somebody who is not necessarily is not somebody who was necessarily very fond of the Muslim community? Am I correct in my assessment of that?
I don't think so, because again, when statements are taken out of context and out of date, because it was the same person who was also critical of Hitler, because 1937, 1939, the horrors of the Holocaust had not yet come out to the rest of the world. So till then, a lot of people were looking at Hitler or the Nazis as these anti-imperialist forces who were trying to fight off imperialism in different parts of Asia. And that's one reason why the Japs too got on board, because they were looking at a pan-Asianist kind of a resurgence, most of Asia being under British colonial power. But then once the horrors of the Holocaust came out, the Hindu Mahasabha had put out several statements condemning this whole idea of whatever was done to the Jews. So some people say, okay, he compared the Muslims to Negroes, someone said to the Jews. The idea was different. The thing was, including, when someone in the 1937 or 38, when somebody compared him, some newspaper compared him to Jinnah, he said, this is a completely different, we are two different individuals, because on the one hand, Jinnah asked for concessions, whereas I asked for equality before the law for everybody. And I would rate these speeches that he made in the capacity of the president of the Hindu Mahasabha over 6 years, and also a document which in fact I managed to unearth and which probably would come out for the first time in my volume 2, which is the a constitution that the Hindu Mahasabha drafted in 1945, called the Constitution of Free Hindustan. And in fact, the Constituent Assembly actually referenced several aspects of this constitution, and there are a lot of similarities with that and what the eventual constitution was, where Savarkar states in his speeches that my conception of a Hindu Rashtra, the behemoth that is looked as something that's out to gobble everybody up, is one where everybody is equal in the eyes of the law, irrespective of caste, religion, gender and community and all of that. Nobody is going to get extra, the majority is not going to get extra privileges because of their extra numbers, and on similar lines the minorities are not going to get any extra concessions. So your faith is something that is a part of your private life, and don't bring it into the public or into politics. And in fact in the 1938 speech he says, I'd like to assure my non-Hindu brethren of even a ghost of suspicion that they may have, that that the Hindu Rashtra state would actually impinge on their linguistic, their cultural, their religious or political rights. And in fact, if anybody does that, the state should intervene and remove these impingements. But then time and again, he said, yeah, there are going to be the so-called two nations within a nation, as long as there is one section of the Muslim community, which owes its allegiance to the larger Ummah or the brotherhood, which is faith-based rather than on nationhood. And that is till the time that is there are going to be these contestations between these two civilizational conflicts. But once that goes, there is going to be emotional integration, and once that happens, everybody is going to be equal in the eyes of the law. No one is going to be discriminated or treated as second-class citizens or whatever. So, and these very ideals and values get ratified and notified. If someone is just giving a speech or a quote, that's another thing. In a document of the party, as the Constitution of Free Hindustan, everything that we finally have in the Constitution in terms of fundamental rights of citizens, the demarcation of powers between legislature, executive, judiciary, how should government function, all of this laid out, the preamble, in striking similarity to what the eventual Constitution of India turned out to be. So I think a lot of misunderstanding of the person and some of his views were there. I'm not, saying everything about him was glorious. He was, of course, according to me, his largest failing was his inability to carry people along, including members of his own party. The intra-party feuds that were there between him and Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, the Bengal faction versus the Maharashtra faction, all of this led to the eventual nemesis of the Hindu Mahasabha, which got wiped out in the 1946 elections. But then where credit is due, one needs to give that as well.
No, absolutely. Where credit is due, and credit is due to you, because I personally didn't know about this, that, the similarity between the constitution of the Hindu Mahasabha and the Indian constitution. In fact, whatever I have read, I have understood and I have been told that, and this was one of the questions as well, that in fact, Savarkar, Golwalkar and everybody was completely against the Indian constitution in what it is in its current form. And that, of course, this government and this establishment is out
so there too, can I just add a little bit? We say Savarkar, Golwalkar, etc., in one breath. We never know or understand that there were huge differences of opinion between Savarkar and the RSS, and he was never a part of the RSS. As long as Hedgewar was the Sarsang Chalak, there was at least some amount of communication between the two organizations. But I think the Hindu Mahasabha was being very, very condescending. They wanted the RSS to be co-opted as a Boy Scouts or their youth brigade or something, and the RSS did not want to get into politics completely. They wanted to have their own identity and independence. And under Golwalkar, that clash became more and more eminent, where they refused overtures of the Hindu Mahasabha to just become their handmaiden. And in fact, Savarkar is infamous to have said, when he said that there are no achievements of an RSS Swayamsevak, the epitaph on his tomb would have only 3 lines. He was born, he joined the Sangh, and he died. So nothing else in his life is worth mention. So these words were to come to haunt him much later in life. But this was the kind of tussle that was there even between the so-called Hindutva forces that were there at that time. But
No,
we don't
fair,
see those nuances today.
No, very, very true. And which is why at the very start I said that his views were very different from the bunch of thoughts of Golwalkar and very, very different from the policy. But at the end of the day, today, like you said, the Hindu Rashtra or the Hindutva ideology has come down to this. That, and you've written this in your book in a chapter called "Who is a Hindu," just like Savarkar had written in his in that paper. And in your book, you mentioned this, and it's been mentioned many times and I've seen this being mentioned by the BJP, that a Hindu must consider India to be his motherland, which is the Matrubhumi. Your ancestors should be from here, which is the Pitrubhumi, and his holy land should also be India, and that is his Punyabhumi. So Hindu should live in Bharat, and everybody else are guests. Because Buddhism, Jainism, etc. are started with India, which is why we consider these people as Indians. But Abrahamic faiths are people who migrated to our country, which is why they are guests. Am I correct in understanding that this is the same idea of Hindutva that was espoused by Savarkar? And is that something that you also believe in?
No, I don't. This was not what he espoused. And look, I really don't know what the BJP says or does, because I have very little to do with politics or politicians. As an academic, I'm looking at the past, and the present doesn't interest me. It's only the past that interests me more. So as far, I can only talk.
Sorry to interrupt, but the past that you've written has such ramifications on the present that your book is quoted so many times in political narratives and discourses. So that's what I asked the question.
That's not my fault at all. It's how academics get misused. But then, so I really don't know what the BJP or the RSS today has its views on who is a Hindu, etc. But then when this, again, context being so important. So this treatise of Hindutva also came up, when he was in jail, and that was the time the whole Khilafat movement was being launched by Mahatma Gandhi, in the hope, I mean, the roads to hell are always paved with the best of intentions. So he, of course, hoped that, for Hindu-Muslim unity and so on, he'd launched this movement. But that movement I consider as one of the most pernicious and dangerous movements which brought religion into politics for the first time like never before, where you were mobilizing a group, on communal lines for a communal cause. What was the Khilafat movement? I mean, Turkey had been won by the British in the First World War. The Turkish people did not want their caliph as their ruler, and Mustafa Kemal Ataturk came to power after that in a democratic process. But then some section, a small section of maybe Sunni Muslims in India considered him as a holy, symbol of the Holy Prophet and so on. And so to appease them, you launch a movement and say, you join the Congress movement. In return, we will support you for this Khilafat. And in 1 year of this, are you going to barter somebody's association for a national cause for an international cause which has no relevance? 1,000 kilometers from here, who rules Turkey should be of no significance to a Muslim, Christian, Jew, Parsi, whoever, Hindu or anyone. It's their problem. And when their people don't want him, who are you to, dictate terms? And it was a movement that was doomed for failure. We were a slave nation. That country was won by Britain in war. Just because 1,000 people are going to raise black flags here, they're not going to accede to your request and put whom you want there. But still this was used. And Gandhi had actually promised the people of this country that within 1 year of the launch of this, you're going to get both Swaraj as well as Khilafat re-established in Turkey. Now, neither of it happened. And the backlash of that was, when you mobilize a mob on communal lines, on religious lines, even the person who mobilizes it later loses control of it. It goes berserk. And that's what happened maybe during the Ram Janmabhoomi movement too, where the leaders themselves lost control and whatever happened. So here too, large-scale violence, Hindu carnages that happened all through the 20s was a direct offshoot of the Khilafat movement, starting from the Mopla carnage in Malabar to riots in Kohat and Panipat and Delhi, Bengal, Calcutta, different parts of India. And during all these times, the response of the Congress and particularly of Gandhi was highly pusillanimous, where even the Moplas, who had massacred thousands and thousands of Nair men, women and children, were actually praised as being brave patriots who were fighting for their religion, by a messiah of non-violence, which is very, very ironic. So at that point of time, somebody needed to give an intellectual counter to this and also say, how do I the people are just going weird in different directions. Do I define a group, our nationhood? And time and again, right from the beginning of that treatise, he says, Hindutva is not about Hinduism at all. It's not related to the theological construct of the religion, but it is a cultural and a national identity marker. Anybody who lives within the Indus and the seas, who considers this land as the land of their forefathers and a sacred land, not in terms of religion again, but owes their allegiance and loyalty to this country and not to some Turkey and its sultan, and fights for this country in a barter for a cause extraterritorial. Such a person is a Hindu, irrespective of which religion he may belong to. And in fact, he goes on to state even in that someone like a Nanny Besant or a Sister Nivedita, who were actually not, they were of the same Abrahamic faiths that you spoke about. One of them converted, one did not. So he says, what do we do with such people? So he says, it may not be their Pitru Bhumi, the land of their forefathers, but it is their Punya Bhumi, because they have done much more for this country than indigenous Indians have. So in such a case, these people also become Hindus, again, not religious connotation, but through a cultural and national way. So you needed to unify people and bring them to a common cause for the nation, and not fight battles which are irrelevant, which are extraterritorial allegiance, which would have harmed the security and sovereignty of this country hugely.
No, fair. No, you mentioned about a very interesting passage from the Essentials of Hindutva. Is that the one that you quoted? The one about
yes.
And I'm glad you spoke about that, because that was something that I wanted to actually ask in terms of clarification from you, saying that he's written about this so elaborately. We've run out of time, unfortunately. I had promised only to take this up to 7:15, but if you have 5 more minutes on you, I want to ask you a very.
I have all the time, Rishabh.
No, it's a Sunday evening. Listen, you've been very kind. It's a Sunday evening for a historian. And
we're boring people. We don't party much. So
and you just got off a Zoom call, but then again, it's very gracious of you. So let me ask you this very contentious issue. His hatred, not hatred, but his his ideology of going about a Hindu Rashtra, about Hindutva, about things for India were very different from that of Mahatma Gandhi. He has been acquitted, of course, and there is nothing nothing as such which is on record which proves that he is somebody who had a role to play in the assassination of the father of the nation. But at the same point in time, there is evidence, incontrovertible evidence, in fact, in some cases, or at least as some people would like young people to believe, that when it came to his meeting about Nathuram Godse, the fact that he lied about it and later was disproved, according to a few people, the police records of 1948, the Kapoor Commission records much later, and so on and so forth. Doesn't this show that not just Godse being a member of the Hindu Mahasabha, but in some way, when he says Yashashvi Bhava, in his last interaction with Nathuram Godse, which he refuses and which later on gets proved apparently, don't you think that there was, objectively asking you this, and because you say that you've objectively written the book, do you touch upon this in your second book, and do you think that there was some nexus, some connection in some way?
So I do touch upon it after 11,100 pages of the Gandhi murder trial from the National Archives of India are what I had to rummage through, and for someone who was not a lawyer to go through the legalese and all of that, and another 2,000 pages of the Kapoor Commission report as well. So when you say it was proved that he said Yashasvi Houn Ya, so that was in Marathi that he said, So where was it proved? And if it was proved, why was he acquitted? So that itself, when you repeat a lie several times, it assumes the quality of a truth is what usually happens. So nowhere, I mean, the evidence against Savarkar was completely based on a police approver's confessions. One of the persons in the whole plot called Digambar Badge. Badge's confessions under police coercion, he willfully became an approver and gave a lot of statements, which were all, I mean, circumstantial. You went there, he said this, one person said this, someone else said no, he didn't say this, the third person said no, we never met. So in such a case, what does a judge do? So that on the basis of that was what the judge of the trial court actually said. This was a false evidence that was given by Badge, but then that doesn't deny the fact that Godse was a part of the Mahasabha. Godse as well as Apte were trusted lieutenants of Savarkar from 1939. In fact, Godse was one of his secretaries when he was in Ratnagiri for 13 years, and very a trusted one at that. And so during the Mahasabha days in Pune was where these two gentlemen were part of, and there was also this organization called the Hindu Rashtra Dal that was formed within the Mahasabha, because the RSS was not playing tango to you. Savarkar thought we'll have a youth brigade of our own, and that was the Hindu Rashtra Dal, and these men were part of that. But then there was a fallout between Godse and Savarkar closer to freedom, because as freedom was coming closer, Savarkar was getting more and more pacifist. And in fact, he, in his testimony in court, Godse says, we were so disillusioned with Savarkar and all the older members of the Hindu Mahasabha because they were becoming so pacifist. They chided us when we went and disrupted Gandhi's meetings, and they also accepted the tricolor, and Savarkar hoisted it on top of his house on 15th of August, which we do not agree of. He allowed Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, his protege from the Mahasabha, to join Nehru's interim government in 1947. And after all of this, we decided to break away from him and chart our own course. So in fact, Godse's dying declaration, so to say, his testimony in court says that I do not have any, I mean, he did not know anything about this conspiracy, or we were fed up of him and all the older folks, B.S. Moonjay and several others, who had become more and more, pro-Congress as the independence was drawing near, and we did what we did on our own. And so, there's no time for me to go into further details of the legal aspects of the case or the Kapoor Commission and so on. But then, as late as 2018, this case was reopened in the Supreme Court of India, which again, people may not know, it somehow missed the media scrutiny somehow. Some individual brought it up in a PIL in the Bombay High Court, which dismissed it. Then it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court appointed an amicus curiae to look into this case. And the Supreme Court, headed by a constitutional bench, headed by who was not then, but now the Chief Justice of India, Justice Bobde, actually comes out saying the Kapoor Commission's findings that Savarkar is complicit in Gandhi's murder are completely inaccurate. There is nothing that overturns the 1949 trial verdict that he was innocent of the crime. So that kind of settles it, I hope, once and for all. Because, if the highest court of the country also gives someone an acquittal, if you have an agenda which will go on and on and on saying, oh no, but this, oh no, but that also, but this also, then there's no end. You have to stop the buck somewhere and lay a matter to rest.
You have to stop the buck somewhere, and you have to stop the conversation somewhere, because he's a very gracious man. But we've taken too much of his time, and I really appreciate you providing that insight on Gandhi, because up until now there is this confusion, and also there are these social media websites and now WhatsApp universities that basically collaborate and give a lot of information on how Nathuram Godse, Veer Savarkar and Mahatma Gandhi, and there is something more that doesn't meet the eye. But I'm glad that you've given that clarification, and I would have loved to ask you more questions, but unfortunately Instagram has a time limit of 1 hour. So let me end by saying this, that quite honestly, you can't dismiss the notion that Savarkar was somebody who's contributed to the national struggle. And at the same point in time, history has not been very kind to him, given the fact that there's very little that has been written about him. This is a man that we spoke to today who's actually gone ahead and researched so much about Veer Savarkar, and then has put together this two-pronged volume, which is a mammoth work and also takes a very long time to read, but is also very, very interesting. And I may not have read the first one as soon as it came out, but I can promise you that if you send me a personally signed copy, I will read the next one immediately. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, Vikram Sampath-ji. Honestly, so much to learn from historians, because if you don't know where you've come from, you honestly won't know where you're going.
Thank you, Rishabh ji. It was wonderful talking to you, and thanks to all the people who are continuing to comment. And I think we're so sorry we couldn't, I think, take all the questions and comments due to lack of time. So there's always something for the next time to do.
and I'm going to hold you on that promise as soon as that book comes out.
Indeed. Okay.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye bye.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.